So we all started out in technical areas, and then we gravitated toward business. I'm an MBA student at UVM now, and you went into marketing. That's the business oriented, and Robert, you also started an MBA program, I believe, right?
I started an MBA with the University of Liverpool. It's on the back burner now, just for no money.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. Why is education so expensive here in Vermont? I believe UVM has just raised their tuition, and it's incredibly expensive, even for in-state residents. I wish something could be done about that. And I think your daughter is going to school in New Hampshire, right?
UNH, University of New Hampshire. Again, she's working on her PhD and couldn't afford to do it in Vermont.
But she's getting a better price in New Hampshire.
Well, actually, they're practically paying her to go there.
So that's really strange. Why someone who is a resident of Vermont has to go out of state
to afford to go to college?
Yeah,
at another state-run school next door.
So when we get into the Senate, maybe we could do something about that. Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity to appropriate or right-size our education systems. I mean, one of the things that kind of blows my mind walking around on a college campus, pick one anywhere, you know, there's an enormous amount of energy waste, there's an enormous amount of just material waste. Does everything need to be brass, polished, glossy marble? I mean, can we get real in terms of what's the real value of having these overbuilt campuses that cost so much money to maintain and to build? You know, all these colleges still have huge endowments, and it's one of the biggest sort of resource pits in the country if you think about it. I mean, how much money is locked up in campus endowments? What's the value of that? I'm sure that's...
The distribution, too, is important. You know, the big endowments, where are they? Yale and Harvard have those big endowments. But who gets to go to those universities?
Right.
It's the children of the rich families.
Right.
Now, if you're born into a poor family, you don't get to go to Yale or Harvard.
Unless you're really lucky. I mean, there's a few standouts that somehow get through the system, and you know that's why I went to Washington and Lee. They offered me a great scholarship, and I was glad to try something new, get out of Vermont. But at the end of the day, I'm looking around and how much money is just being wasted, and how many of those students are really just there to get the stamp, get their little piece of paper, and then fall into a job with daddy's company, you know, and what's the real value there? I think that there's a huge amount of get real factor that needs to hit our universities kind of across the board.
But having lived in Europe, you must know the difference between the European and the...
Right.
In Europe, education is free.
Well, not only that, but in high school, you pick a trade, you pick a skill. My wife studied nursing and graduated from high school ready to be a registered nurse. You know, what did our kids graduate from high school ready to do in this country? Not much, you know. So
they really have more freedom than we did too, because if you want to be a doctor or if you want to get a PhD, you can do that over there, and you don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that hit me the most living in Belgrade especially during this time when the whole economy's collapsed. There were something like 600,000 refugees within the city limits of 2.5 million people, and you know, really disturbing visual kind of urban landscape. But at the same time, you have conversations with people who are unemployed, working as a janitor, or you know, really low-level jobs. They're amazingly educated. They totally, you know, exceed the average American sort of grasp of world geopolitics, just how the economies work, their own little skill set that they, you know, specialized in. Highly educated, and you know, no economy to put that to work with. Where, you know, back in the U.S., we're still seen globally as the leader in, especially higher education. You know, lots of people come to the U.S. for the colleges, and it's still seen as one of the strengths that the U.S. has. And it's a puzzler to me because it seems like another version of greenwashing, in a sense. It's like, where's the real value? What are these students really getting for their dollars? And then when you look at what tuition costs these days, I mean, that's the average Vermont household income cannot get 1 year tuition paid for.
At UVM.
Right. I mean, that's it's furthering this haves and have-nots division. That
You talk about people coming here to go to school. That's like saying, well, people are immigrants too. We have immigrants coming here. But that gives a wrong impression because every country has that.
Right.
And there are people immigrating to France and in Sweden. And some countries make it easier than others. But the world isn't knocking on the door, banging down the door to get into America
Right.
or into our schools.
Well, that's the
Especially-
impression that academia in this country holds. They still, I think, have that illusion.
Yes, it's an illusion.
Yeah, it is an illusion, and although a company in another country such as France or Switzerland might be very happy to take one of their own people and employ them because they had studied at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, they're not so inclined to take someone that was educated in a major institution who's from the States. It's actually very, very difficult to get a job abroad if you've only been educated here. The competition is just too intense. These people have been much better educated from the ground up, and they're much more highly skilled. So we're actually, with an American education, having grown up here, we're not competitive in the world market. And that's one of the things that in my job search over the years I discovered.
I found that out too. I have my resume done up in French and Swedish. I'm fluent in those two languages. And I tried to get a job in France and Sweden back in the 90s. And I found that it was quite difficult. You have to, it's not just being fluent in the language isn't quite enough. You have to really, you know, be able to speak fast and have a tremendous command of the language. And that's one of the main obstacles to getting a job.
That's one of the other things that, especially European schools systems do so well, is everyone learns 2 or 3 languages. My wife speaks 5 languages fluently, and I'm learning still a couple other ones, but you know, it's like, what's the skill set that we are arming our general populace with? And where's the value for general high-level education across the board? And why is it, you know, relegated to this elitist sort of slice? If you're lucky, you can get in and you can get through one of these high-end universities to further your career, supposedly, when everyone else is stuck in the service sector, since we're not making anything anymore. Where's the value? I think it's obvious that we've lost that value. And if you, in my impression, you know, go around and just do a general survey of the general populace of the U.S., the education level is pretty low across the board.
So Robert, why did you decide to run for the Senate?
That's a good question. There's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that it's an icebreaker to conversation. I can go out in my community, I can go all over Addison County and ask people about the issues of the day, ask them, you know, what's going on in your own lives, how do you feel? That's something that the incumbents, the Democrats and Republicans, are not doing. They're not talking to the real people out there. Another reason is that there's a huge leak of resources, which is keeping Vermont poor, keeping us from being able to afford things like a higher education. There's a tremendous amount of money flowing out of Vermont on a yearly basis. There's $1.5 billion a year, which is Vermont's share in the military budget, and there's about $1.2 billion a year in tax-free resource extraction by major corporations. And I mean Nestle extracting groundwater, Entergy using surface water and groundwater and paying nothing for it and polluting it and not paying a fine. I just consider it ludicrous that in a state that imposes a $6,000 fine on a windmill owner because his windmill was a few meters a little further up the ridgeline than he had permission to put that windmill, $6,000 fine. Entergy pollutes the groundwater, stockpiles nuclear waste on the side of the Connecticut River in a floodplain, and what do they pay? Zero. So there's an incredible amount of mineral extraction going on, timber extraction going on in Vermont, and we're practically a banana republic as far as that goes. Preliminary estimates show $1.2 billion per year extracted by major corporations from Vermont and nothing returned.